Picture this. The air in the great thatched hall is thick with the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and the sweet, cloying aroma of banana wine. You are a boy of 14, chosen for your grace and beauty, standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others just like you. You are a royal page, a living decoration in the court of the Kabaka of Buganda. The king, Mwanga II, a young man himself, not yet 20, watches you all. His eyes, pools of mercurial shadow, drift across the sea of young faces, and when they land on you, a hollow dread settles in your stomach like a stone. It is a look of ownership, a look that promises favor but demands a terrifying intimacy, a complete surrender of self. This is the heart of power, and you are its most vulnerable vessel. And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. The sprawling, labyrinthine palace of the Kabaka of Buganda, perched atop the hills of Mengo, was a world unto itself, a universe governed by traditions as old and as deeply rooted as the ancient trees that shaded its reed-fenced enclosures. Long before the first white man's boots had trod upon the red earth of this kingdom, the court of the Kabaka was the undeniable center of all life, a place of immense political power, spiritual significance, and terrifying, absolute authority. To understand the tragedy of Mwanga II, one must first understand the world that made him. His father, Kabaka Mutesa I, had been a ruler of legendary stature, a man of formidable intellect and cunning diplomacy who had successfully played the arriving Arab traders and European explorers against one another, preserving the sovereignty of his kingdom through sheer force of will. The court he presided over was a masterpiece of political stagecraft. It was here that the chiefs of the various clans, the Bataka, came to pay homage, their loyalty not just a political necessity, but a sacred duty. The rituals were elaborate, the etiquette suffocatingly precise, and at the heart of it all was the Kabaka, a figure considered semi-divine, a man whose every whim could mean life or death. Into this gilded cage, Prince Mwanga was born, a child of privilege destined for a throne that demanded a strength he had not yet cultivated. His childhood was one of strange contradictions. He was surrounded by the trappings of immense power, yet constantly reminded of his subservience to his father. He was educated not in letters and numbers in the European sense, but in the intricate arts of Ganda statecraft, the histories of his ancestors, the delicate balance of clan politics, and the brutal realities of power. Central to this education was the institution of the royal pages, the Bagalagala. These were not mere servants, they were the sons of the kingdom's most powerful chiefs, sent to the palace as a sign of their father's loyalty and as a means to secure their own future influence. They were hostages and apprentices in equal measure. Within the cloistered confines of the royal enclosure, these boys learned to navigate the treacherous currents of court life. They served the Kabaka's food, attended to his every need, and acted as his personal retinue. And within this system, a deeply ingrained tradition of pederasty existed. The Kabaka, and often high-ranking chiefs, would select favored pages for their bed. This was not seen through the lens of morality as the later arriving Christians would define it. It was a raw, undisguised expression of the power dynamic. To be chosen was to be favored, to gain proximity to the Sun King, to secure advancement for oneself and one's family. It was a terrifying honor, an accepted part of the price of ambition. Mwanga grew up steeped in this reality, observing his father, understanding that the bodies of these boys were as much a part of the king's domain as the land and the cattle. It was a system of sexualized feudalism, where personal intimacy was inextricably linked with political power, a system that functioned on a delicate balance of fear, ambition, and a shared cultural understanding. The arrival of the first Christian missionaries during his father's reign was a curiosity, another piece on the geopolitical chessboard for Muteesa to maneuver. But for the young Prince Mwanga, these strange men with their even stranger god represented a disruption he could not yet comprehend. They spoke of a king who ruled the heavens, an authority higher than the Kabaka, a moral code that did not bend to the will of earthly rulers. They planted seeds of a new world in the fertile minds of the very pages Mwanga had grown up alongside. The same pages he one day expected to command with the same absolute authority his father wielded. He inherited not just a throne, but a slow-burning fire that was destined to consume everything he knew. The death of the great Kabaka Mutesa I in the year of 1884 was not merely the passing of a king, it was the extinguishing of a central, steadying fire that had warmed and illuminated the kingdom of Buganda for nearly 3 decades. The smoke had barely cleared from the royal funeral pyres when his son, Mwanga II, ascended to the throne. A youth of just 18 thrust into a role that would have tested a man twice his age and of a far more stable temperament. He inherited a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge, a reality his shrewd father had managed with masterful ambiguity, but which Mwanga, with his volatile mix of insecurity and arrogance, was uniquely ill-equipped to handle. The throne he now occupied felt grotesquely oversized, a garment of power tailored for a giant, and he felt like a boy swimming in its folds. This profound sense of inadequacy would become the defining feature of his reign, a deep-seated psychological flaw that would manifest as public cruelty and catastrophic misrule. His obsession with projecting an aura of absolute control was a direct reflection of the terror he felt at its potential loss. He mimicked his father's autocratic style but lacked the accompanying wisdom and patience, resulting in a caricature of authority, all thunder and no rain. The political landscape he surveyed from the heights of Mango Hill was a viper's nest of competing interests. To the east and south, the great European powers, Britain and Germany, were carving up the continent like a carcass, their hunger for territory insatiable, their agents disguised as explorers and missionaries. From the north and from the coast, the influence of Arab traders and the religion of Islam they brought with them presented another powerful, competing ideology. But the most immediate and insidious threat, in Mwanga's eyes, was not external but internal. It was a cancer growing within the very heart of his court, in the minds of his own people. His father, Muteesa, had welcomed the first Protestant missionaries from the Church Missionary Society and the French Catholic White Fathers as a geopolitical strategy, a way to acquire European knowledge, guns, and a potential alliance against the Egyptians to the north. He allowed them to teach, to preach, to build their modest little churches in the shadow of his great palace. He saw their God as a curious but manageable deity, another spirit to be added to the Ganda pantheon. He failed to see that this new faith was not a spirit to be managed, but a fire that demanded to be the only fire. Mwanga inherited this burgeoning Christian community, which had taken root most deeply among the young, impressionable pages of the royal court. These were his childhood companions, the very boys he now expected to serve him, to fear him, and to submit to him in all things, just as they had submitted to his father. But something had profoundly changed. When he looked at them now, he saw a flicker of defiance in their eyes, a new allegiance he could not command. They spoke of their baptism, of a loyalty to a heavenly king that superseded their loyalty to their earthly one. This was not merely a religious disagreement, it was a declaration of treason. The paranoia that had been a quiet hum in the back of his mind began to roar. Every whispered prayer was a conspiracy, every gathering of converts a potential coup. His sexual dysfunction, his inability to command the intimate fealty of his pages as his father had done, had metastasized into a political psychosis. The traditions that had defined power in Buganda for centuries were being systematically dismantled by an invisible god, and Mwanga, in his desperate, flailing attempts to reassert his dominance, was about to unleash a storm of violence that would stain the red hills of his kingdom with the blood of martyrs and seal its eventual doom. The arrival of the men in black cassocks and simple clerical collars was at first a source of fascination in the court of Kabaka Mutesa I. The French Catholic White Fathers and the British Protestant missionaries of the Church Missionary Society were a study in contrasts, rivals in theology, yet united in their singular, revolutionary purpose: to dethrone the old gods of Buganda and install their own. To the sophisticated and politically astute Ganda court, they were initially perceived as little more than curiosities, new players in the complex game of influence. They brought with them not just Bibles and crucifixes, but also literacy, medicine, and access to the tantalizing world of European technology. For a time, they were treated as compliant system enforcers, albeit for a foreign power. Their presence tolerated and even encouraged as long as they understood the supreme authority of the Kabaka. What Mwanga II, and perhaps even his father before him, failed to grasp was the insidious nature of the ideas they preached. The Christian doctrine was not simply a new set of rituals to be layered atop the old ones. It was a fundamental challenge to the very structure of Buganda society. It spoke of a universal brotherhood, a moral law that applied equally to king and peasant, and a personal relationship with a single, jealous God whose authority was absolute and eternal. This message found its most fertile ground among the Bagalagala, the royal pages. For these young men, trapped in a system that demanded their total subservience, Christianity offered a radical, liberating alternative. It gave them a sense of individual worth and a moral framework that stood in stark opposition to the often arbitrary and brutal whims of their king. The traditional power dynamic of the court, which included the sexual submission of pages to their masters, was suddenly reframed not as a customary exercise of power but as a mortal sin. The sacrament of baptism became a quiet declaration of independence. When a page was baptized, he was symbolically reborn, his ultimate loyalty transferred from the palace on Mengo Hill to a kingdom in heaven. He now had a reason, a divine justification, to say no. This was an act of rebellion more profound than any armed uprising. It struck at the very heart of Mwanga's authority, which was predicated on the unquestioning obedience of his subjects. The conflict was therefore inevitable, a collision of two irreconcilable absolutisms. On one side stood Mwanga, the embodiment of a centuries-old tradition where the king's desire was law. On the other side stood the converts, armed with the terrifying conviction of their new faith, willing to defy their king in the name of their God. The missionaries, who had once sought the king's favor to protect their fledgling missions, now found themselves the spiritual leaders of a growing insurgency. They provided the ideology that fueled the defiance. The pages, who once vied for the Kabaka's glance, now gathered in secret to read the Gospels and recite the Catechism. They learned that their bodies were temples of the Holy Spirit, not to be defiled, not even by the king himself. This theological distinction had devastating real-world consequences. When Mwanga made his advances, seeking the same intimate submission his father had enjoyed, he was met with polite but firm refusal. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this rejection for a king so consumed by his own insecurity? It was a direct assault on his manhood, his kingship, and his divinity. The sacred and the political were so deeply intertwined that a denial of his personal sexual desires was indistinguishable from an act of high treason. The new faith had given his victims a shield, and Mwanga, with his limited tools of traditional power, knew only one way to break it: with overwhelming, systematic cruelty. The first tremors of the earthquake to come were felt in the early months of 1885. The ground beneath Mwanga's throne, already unstable, began to crack. The youthful king's attempts to rule by fear and intimidation were proving ineffective against a force he could not comprehend. His authority, which should have been absolute, was being openly challenged, not by powerful rival chiefs in a language of power he understood, but by the youngest and most vulnerable members of his own household, the pages he had inherited from his father. The source of this unprecedented defiance was the new religion, the white man's faith, which was spreading through the warrens of the royal enclosure like a fever. It was a plague of disobedience, and Mwanga felt his control slipping away, his every command now subject to the moral calculus of a foreign god. The first notable victims were three young Protestant converts, Yusufu Rugarama, Mako, Kakumba, and Nuwa Sirwanga. They had been part of a mission sent by the king, but had tarried at the Protestant mission station, learning to read the Bible. For Mwanga, this was an act of gross insubordination. Their loyalty was to him, their time was his to command. He ordered their execution in January of 1885, a swift and brutal message intended to quench the growing embers of rebellion. But the fire did not die. It merely went underground, glowing hotter in the secret gatherings of the faithful. The central point of friction, the issue that would truly ignite the king's rage, was the direct challenge to his personal and sexual prerogatives. The culture of the court had long entitled the Kabaka to the bodies of his pages. This was a raw and fundamental expression of his power. Yet, When Muwanga, seeking to affirm his dominance in the same manner as his ancestors, made his advances towards a young page named Mujafu, he was rebuffed. The boy, a Christian convert, refused the king's demand. This was not merely a personal rejection, it was a constitutional crisis in miniature. The king's most intimate desires were being vetoed by the authority of this new god. The personal humiliation was inseparable from the political challenge. His paranoia, already simmering, began to boil over. He saw conspiracies everywhere, his most trusted attendants now suspect, their whispered prayers sounding like sedition. He ordered his chief minister, the Katikiro Mukasa, a man of the old traditionalist faction who viewed the Christians with deep suspicion, to spy on the pages. The palace, once a place of rigid but understood protocols, became a nest of fear and surveillance. The breaking point came with one of his most beloved attendants, a young man named Joseph Mukasa Balikudembe. Balikudembe was a Catholic and a leader among the converts in the palace. He was brave, respected, and deeply devout. When Muwanga, in a fit of rage, personally executed a Protestant bishop, James Hannington, who had defied custom by approaching the kingdom from the forbidden eastern route, Balikudembe dared to do the unthinkable. He admonished the king. He told Muwanga that he had acted rashly, that he had shed innocent blood. Can you imagine the audacity? A servant rebuking a king considered semi-divine. For Muwanga, this was the ultimate betrayal. This was not just disobedience, it was judgment. It confirmed his deepest fears that the Christians were creating an alternate center of power, a moral tribunal to which even the king was subject. In November of 1885, he ordered Balikudembe's execution. The page was taken to a swamp outside the capital, bound, and burned alive. As the flames consumed him, Balikudembe sent a final message to his king, a plea for Muwanga to repent, lest he face the judgment of the very god he was defying. The message, meant to save, only served to harden Muwanga's heart and set the stage for the horrific massacre to come. The cracks had become a chasm, and the kingdom was about to fall in. The story of the Great Persecution is not merely a political or historical account. It is a deeply human tragedy, a narrative whose central figures are the helpless victims, individuals trapped by the collision of a tyrant's will and the unyielding demands of a new and uncompromising faith. Their story is one of profound suffering, of the systematic stripping away of their humanity, and of a desperate struggle to hold on to a sense of self in the face of an overwhelming and brutal force. Their fate, for almost all, was unalterably tragic. After the execution of Joseph Mukasa Balikudembe, a chilling quiet fell over the court, the kind of silence that precedes a hurricane. The Christian converts knew that their protector was gone and that the king's rage was far from sated. The leadership of the small, terrified community of believers fell to a man of remarkable courage and composure, Charles Luwanga. A Catholic convert and the newly appointed master of the royal pages, Luwanga now found himself in the impossible position of shepherd to a flock marked for slaughter. He knew that a final, terrible test was coming. He spent his nights secretly baptizing his fellow pages, including a young boy named Kizito, who at just 14 was the youngest of the group. Kizito, full of the pure and simple faith of a child, had been terrified of the king's wrath, but under Luwanga's gentle guidance, he found a resolve that belied his years. The storm broke on the 25th of May in the year 1886. Muwanga returned to his capital in a foul mood, having learned that one of his pages had been receiving instruction from the Catholic missionaries. He summoned his entire court. In a terrifying display of absolute power, he separated the Christians from the rest of his attendants, asking a simple question, "Do you intend to remain Christians?" Led by Charles Luwanga, the pages, one by one, affirmed their faith. This was their death sentence. Muwanga condemned them all to be marched to the traditional execution site at Namugongo, a place of dread, miles away. The journey itself was an ordeal designed to break them. They were bound together with ropes and slave yokes, prodded and mocked by the king's guards, the enforcers of his will who acted out of fear and a desensitized acceptance of the system. Along the way, several were killed, speared by the guards for faltering or for the sheer sport of cruelty. Yet, accounts from the survivors speak of an eerie sense of peace among the condemned. They prayed, they sang hymns, and they encouraged one another. Charles Lwanga, their leader, was separated from the group and subjected to a particularly cruel death. He was burned slowly, from the feet up, by the chief executioner, a man who seemed to take a perverted pleasure in the prolonged agony of his victim. Yet even in his torment, Lwanga remained steadfast, famously telling his killer, "You are burning me, but it is as if you are pouring water over my body." The remaining group, numbering over 30, finally reached Namugongo on the 3rd of June. There, they were wrapped in reed mats, their bodies bundled like firewood, and placed upon a massive pyre. Among them was the boy, Kizito, who, seeing the terrifying preparations, had begun to cry. He was comforted by the older boys, his fear giving way to a shared, solemn courage. As the executioners lit the pyre, the victims began to pray aloud, their voices rising together in a final, defiant chorus until the roar of the flames and their own screams silenced them forever. Theirs was the ultimate fate of the helpless victim in a totalitarian system. Their humanity was denied, their bodies were destroyed, but their struggle to maintain a sense of self, in their case their spiritual self, became their only remaining form of resistance. The climactic purges of May and June 1886 were the volcanic eruption of a pressure that had been building deep within the psyche of Muwanga II. To view these events as a simple political calculation, a coldly logical move to eliminate a threat, is to misunderstand the man at the center of the storm. This was not statecraft. It was a deeply personal, psychological exorcism played out on a national stage. This was the tyrant's rage, a convulsion of violence born from a profound sense of humiliation, sexual frustration, and a terror of his own inadequacy. Within the crucible of his mind, the personal and the political had fused into a single, molten obsession. The Christian pages had done more than simply disobey him, they had judged him. Their refusal to submit to his sexual advances, a traditional perquisite of his power, was not just an act of defiance but an invalidation of his very identity as Kabaka. The god they worshipped had rendered him impotent, both literally and figuratively, in his own palace. Can you imagine the psychological torture for a young king, already haunted by the long shadow of his powerful father, to be so thoroughly rejected by those he was meant to command absolutely? His world was predicated on a system of dominance, and these boys, with their quiet faith, had dismantled it from within. His cruelty was not the detached cruelty of a political strategist, but the hot, frenzied rage of a spurned lover, a fury that demanded not just death, but annihilation. He needed to erase the source of his humiliation. The methodology of the executions themselves speaks to this deep-seated psychological motivation. He did not simply have the pages speared quickly, a common method of execution in Buganda. Instead, he chose the slow, agonizing process of the death march and the horror of the pyre at Namugongo. He needed them to suffer, to recant, to acknowledge his power over their physical bodies even if he could not command their souls. The public nature of the spectacle was crucial. He forced his entire court to witness the condemnation, to see the consequences of this new faith. It was a desperate performance of authority, a bloody spectacle designed to scream a single message: I am still king. I am still the source of all power. My will is absolute. The presence of the executioners, the complicit system enforcers, was vital to this performance. These men, like the chief executioner Muwanga, were instruments of the king's will, their hands stained with the blood of the victims. They acted not necessarily from a place of ideological agreement, but from a mixture of fear, duty, and the brutalizing logic of a system where defying the king was unthinkable. They were the physical manifestation of Mwanga's rage, the tools he used to translate his internal torment into external violence. In the flickering firelight of the great pyre at Namugongo, Mwanga sought to cauterize the wound to his ego. He believed that by turning the bodies of the martyrs to ash, he could destroy the ideas they represented. He was trying to kill a ghost, to murder a god that had taken up residence in the hearts of his people. But in doing so, he achieved the very opposite. His actions transformed the victims from disobedient servants into transcendent martyrs. The fire that was meant to erase them instead forged them into legends, their story becoming the foundational myth of a new, powerful religion that would ultimately outlive and overpower the very monarchy he had killed to protect. His rage, in its all-consuming fire, had consumed his own future. The ashes had barely cooled at Namugongo before Muwanga II began to realize his catastrophic miscalculation. The Great Persecution, intended to be a final, terrifying display of absolute authority that would cow his subjects back into traditional submission, had the opposite effect. It did not extinguish the fire of Christianity. It fanned it into an uncontrollable blaze. The horrifying story of the martyrs, their courage in the face of unspeakable cruelty, spread through the kingdom like a contagion of faith. The victims were no longer just dead pages. They had become saints, their execution ground a holy site, their story a powerful new scripture written in blood. This unforeseen outcome completely destabilized the fragile political ecosystem of Buganda. Mwanga's brutal purge had alienated not just the growing Christian faction, but also other powerful groups within his court. The kingdom began to unravel. The act of supreme terror had shattered the king's mystique, revealing him not as a semi-divine authority, but as a volatile and dangerously unpredictable tyrant. The Christian converts, both Catholic and Protestant, who had once been rivals for influence, were now united by their shared experience of persecution. They began to organize, to arm themselves, and to see the removal of Mwanga as not just a political necessity, but a moral imperative. In a stunning turn of events, this Christian faction found an unlikely ally: the kingdom's Muslim contingent. The Muslims, who had also vied for royal favor, saw in the king's erratic violence a threat to all monotheistic faiths and a chance to seize power for themselves. In 1888, just 2 years after the executions at Namugongo, this unlikely coalition of Christians and Muslims staged a successful coup. They stormed the palace at Mengo, and Muwanga, the fearsome tyrant, was forced to flee for his life, escaping in a canoe across the vast waters of Lake Victoria. The kingdom he had fought so brutally to control had slipped through his fingers. His brother, Kiwewa, was installed on the throne, only to be quickly deposed by the Muslim faction, who then installed another brother, Kalama. The kingdom descended into a chaotic civil war, a three-way conflict between the Christian, Muslim, and traditionalist factions. It was in this crucible of chaos that Mwanga saw his only path back to power. In a move of breathtaking cynicism, the king who had murdered Christians for their faith now reached out to them from his exile, positioning himself as their champion against the new Muslim rulers. The Christian faction, desperate for the legitimacy that only a royal figurehead could provide, agreed to an alliance. With the help of Charles Mwanga's old student and now a prominent leader, Honorat Nyonyintono, Mwanga returned at the head of a Christian army in 1889, retaking his throne. But the kingdom he returned to was irrevocably broken, and the king who now sat on the throne was a shadow of his former self. He was king in name only, a puppet of the very Christian chiefs he had once tried to destroy, men who now held the real power, backed by their growing armies and the promise of European support. His desperate attempt to reassert his traditional authority had failed utterly, leaving his kingdom fractured, weakened, and ripe for the picking by the colonial powers gathering at its borders. The final years of Muwanga II's reign were a slow, agonizing slide into irrelevance, the tragic epilogue to a story of failed tyranny. Having ridden back to power on the backs of the Christian forces he once sought to annihilate, he found himself a prisoner on his own throne. The kingdom of Buganda was now a fractured landscape of armed factions, and real authority lay not with the Kabaka, but with the victorious Christian chiefs, the Apollo Kagwa of the Protestant faction and the Stanislas Mugwanya of the Catholic faction. These men, once his pages and his intended victims, were now his masters, dictating policy and controlling the instruments of state. Mwanga was trapped in the cage he had inadvertently helped to build, his sovereignty a hollow fiction. Into this volatile mix stepped Captain Frederick Lugard of the Imperial British East Africa Company in 1890. Lugard, an agent of British colonial ambition, arrived with a small contingent of soldiers and a Maxim gun, a weapon that represented a decisive shift in the balance of power. He cared little for the complex internal politics of Buganda. He saw only a strategic prize in the race for control of the Nile headwaters. Mwanga, in a desperate attempt to play the old game of his father, tried to maneuver between the arriving British and the Germans who were encroaching from the south. But the game had changed. The Europeans were no longer merely guests or potential allies. They were the new masters. Lugard presented Mwanga with a treaty that would place Buganda under the protection of the company, effectively stripping it of its independence. Mwanga resisted. He prevaricated. He raged, but his power was gone. Faced with the quiet, unyielding pressure of the Christian chiefs who saw their future with the British, and the undeniable argument of Lugard's machine gun, Mwanga signed the treaty in 1892. The Kingdom of Buganda became a British protectorate 2 years later. The man who had slaughtered his own people to prevent the erosion of his absolute authority had formally handed that authority over to a foreign power. Yet, the spirit of defiance that had defined his earlier years still flickered within him. In 1897, chafing under the humiliation of his puppet king status, Mwanga made one last desperate gamble. He escaped from his capital and launched a final, feudal rebellion against the British. It was a war he could never win. His forces were scattered, his support was minimal, and the British, with their superior firepower and the collaboration of the Ganda chiefs, hunted him down. He was captured in 1899, a fallen king, a rebel against the empire that now owned his kingdom. The British, in a final act of symbolic subjugation, forced him to be baptized, giving him the Christian name Daniel. The irony was grotesque. The man whose reign was defined by his violent opposition to Christianity was now forcibly inducted into its ranks, his Ganda name erased. He was exiled, sent first to Kismayu, and then, finally, to the remote Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean, a tropical prison for deposed African royalty. There, Daniel Mwanga, the former Kabaka of Buganda, lived out his final years, a relic of a lost world, dying of a heart condition in 1903. It was a profoundly tragic end for the dysfunctional tyrant, a man whose violent struggle against one invading force, Christianity, had only succeeded in paving the way for the victory of another, colonialism. What then is the final historical verdict on Muwanga II, the last truly sovereign king of Buganda? The answer remains as contested and complex as the man himself. History has no single lens, and Mwanga's legacy is a prism that refracts light differently depending on who is looking. For the global Christian church, particularly the Catholic faith, the story is a straightforward and powerful hagiography. Mwanga is the villain, the dark, monstrous tyrant, a new Emperor Nero, whose perverse and bloody actions served only to illuminate the glorious faith and courage of the Uganda martyrs. In this telling, he is a necessary evil, the darkness required to make the light of the saints shine brighter. The focus is not on him, but on Charles Lwanga and his companions, whose sacrifice became the foundational seed of one of Africa's most vibrant Christian communities. Namugongo is not a monument to Mwanga's cruelty, but a shrine to their faith, a place of pilgrimage that draws millions. In this narrative, Mwanga's complex motivations, his political struggles, and the cultural context of his actions are flattened, reduced to a simple backdrop for a story of martyrdom. Yet, for some modern African nationalists and revisionist historians, the portrait is repainted in different colors. They see Mwanga not as a simple monster, but as a tragic anti-colonial figure, a young king who recognized, however imperfectly, the existential threat posed by foreign ideologies. They argue that his methods, while brutal by modern standards, were rooted in the traditional prerogatives of Uganda Kabaka, and that his persecution of the Christians was not a fit of psychotic rage, but a calculated, if ultimately failed, attempt to purge a dangerous foreign influence that was systematically undermining his authority and the integrity of his kingdom. In this view, the martyrs were not innocent victims, but political agents of a colonial vanguard, and Mwanga was a patriot, fighting a desperate rearguard action against the inevitable tide of European imperialism. The truth, as is so often the case, likely resides in the murky, unsettling space between these two poles. Mwanga was almost certainly not a saintly anti-colonial hero. His actions were driven as much by personal paranoia, insecurity, and thwarted desire as by any coherent political strategy. He was a deeply flawed individual, a product of a system of absolute power that was ill-equipped to handle the unprecedented pressures of his time. But neither was he a simple, one-dimensional monster. He was a king fighting for a world that was vanishing before his eyes, using the only tools he had. The ultimate somber reflection rests on the profound human cost of this historical collision. It rests on the bodies of the young men and boys, the helpless victims caught in an impossible vice between the absolute demands of their earthly king and the equally absolute demands of their heavenly one. Theirs is a story about the terrible price of conviction, and a dark, unsettling testament to the ways in which power, faith, sexuality, and politics can intertwine to create a perfect storm of human tragedy. The echoes of Namugongo are not a simple song of faith and victory, but a complex and dissonant chorus of pain, confusion, and the enduring, unanswerable questions about the nature of a king who kept a harem of boys and the God who demanded their lives.